Morning, everybody. I want to talk to you today about how we got or how we get something like an AOC or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is a mouthful in itself. She's obviously sucking all the oxygen out of the room when it comes to the Democratic candidates and other Democratic politicians, especially ones who've been there for a while, like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. But how did we get to a point where someone who says such ignorant things is able to win public office? Now, first off, her opponent, who was the incumbent, didn't take her seriously. He didn't really run a campaign, so she was able to get elected. Now, how do you get to the point, though, where people would vote for you when you make no sense? How do you get to the point where you make no sense? And I really think it sums it up best when you quote Thomas Sowell, who said, "The problem isn't that little Johnny can't read. The problem is that little Johnny can't think." And she is the product of more than one generation of public schooling where you're not taught to think about anything. You're memorized for the test. Just need to know facts. You don't need to know the reasons why. You just need to know that this is what it is because somebody who's supposedly smarter than you told you so. So how do we get to that point? When did we stop as a society, especially as an educational system, stop thinking? And one of the things I heard several years ago was from a gentleman named Roy Masters. And he is a psychiatrist. He has developed a meditation technique to help treat soldiers with PTSD, really anyone that can sit down and follow his meditation technique to help control their PTSD. He is a Messianic Jew. He immigrated from England, from the United Kingdom in the 70s, when, in his own words, when England became a socialist nation, which is about the same time they introduced socialized health care. World War II veteran. And the biggest reason why he became a psychiatrist, though, is when he came out of World War II, he wanted to understand how was Hitler able to do what he did. And essentially that is convince a whole entire nation that it's okay to kill people for no reason other than their religious affiliation. 6 million Jews, 3 million Christians, a few million of some other different religions. And, how was he able to do what he did? And in his studies, it took him to China. And he was studying how the Chinese have remained a communist nation. Where does the communism come from? Why would seemingly such intelligent people, you think about these Chinese kids we see that are these great musicians, they're these great artists, they have these new ideas, they're touted all around the world as being, some of the world's smartest kids. And yet when you look at the nation of China, they don't invent anything new. They steal everybody else's technology. If you're familiar with anything in the motorcycle world, there's the Honda Rebel 250, right? Little bitty parallel twin motorcycle, little runabout kind of thing. It's kind of fun. There's just something small, a little 250. Well, there was a company, I don't know what the status of it is now, but there was a brand of motorcycles you could buy here in the United States called Alpha Sports, or I think they even had another name for them. But they were virtually identical. You could literally repair the Alpha Sports 250 with the same parts from a Honda Rebel 250. Why? Because China, despite the patents and everything else, China took a Honda Rebel, and this company over there basically reverse engineered it and built their own Honda Rebel, slapped a different name on it. They almost look identical. So in his studies in China, though, what he figured out was that at a certain point, your brain shuts off. And you're sitting there scratching your head going, what do you mean what? Well, what they do in China is you are in school, year-round school from basically kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade or college, 16th grade, whatever you want to, 16 years, even if you're going to be a doctor, 20 years of schooling. But what they do, the whole entire time that you are in school, you're constantly taking tests. And I don't mean the weekly, checkup tests to make sure you learned your math equations or that you know how to break down a sentence structure type thing. I mean like a standardized test so frequently. Sound familiar? And so they test you and they test you and they test you, and it's stress after stress after stress, and it just builds up on you. And when you get to a point, if they've determined that you're not intelligent enough to go on to college, so like say you're a tradesman, or in their eyes, for whatever reason, they think, all that testing they've done on you, they've determined you're going to be a tradesman. So you're going to go to the 12th grade and you're going to stop. So when you finish your schooling, for the next 3 to 6 months, depending on how much schooling you've had, all you are allowed to do is study everything that you have ever learned from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade, or, if you went to college and you study everything. You study everything, day in, day out, 6, 7 days a week, all day long, every day. And you study all that, and then you finally, when you finish your study period, you take a test. And what they have found out in China, and what Roy Masters found out in his studies and his research, was that when you finally completed that test, your brain shuts off. And I mean, obviously it doesn't shut down completely because you're still alive and you're still walking and talking, but the portion of your brain that handles the learning shuts down. And a lot of that also has to do with your imagination and your ability to be creatively influenced, or to be a creative thinker or a tinkerer, somebody who's going to invent the next, perpetual motion machine. That part of your brain shuts off. And then you go out and you become a citizen, and they give you a job, they plug you in somewhere, and that's where you exist. And if any of that sounds familiar, that means you were paying attention to the whole Common Core thing, which is exactly what they were doing with Common Core. It's the constant testing. If you read all of the articles, if you paid attention to the news, not the mainstream stuff mostly, but the alternative news sites and whatnot, and all these, you pay attention to your kids coming home from school, and they're a nervous wreck because they couldn't finish all their questions in time on their standardized tests. And they take so many standardized tests now. I thank God here in Alabama they've done away with ACT Aspire. Thank God. But unfortunately, it's been replaced by something else. And, the tests are still timed. It's still a lot of stress on kids, because that's what you do. You test and you test and you test. And that's a lot of pressure on a kid, especially standardized tests, because they have to memorize facts. And, there's not near as many questions about, there's not many of those critical thinking type questions we used to get when I was in school back in the 80s. And even then, they was still trying to push you towards, not necessarily logical type answers, but they were pushing you towards a more emotional type answers. It's, well, 2 + 2 = 4. What do you think about that? Look at this painting. How does it make you feel? How does this literature assignment make you feel? Do you feel good after you've read To Kill a Mockingbird? I mean, it's just really, instead of actually trying to break it down and analyze it, it's not It's not what it actually says, it's how does it make you feel. An example for that crossed my mind is I'm a fan of Salvador Dali, and was a tremendous artist from Spain, has a large museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, that I've been to before. And if you've seen the soft clocks, they're like, it's a clock, it's laying over a branch similar to like a pancake would lay over a branch. When you go through and you study his work, when you study his paintings, every one of his paintings, and he's an abstract artist, he dabbled some in cubism, but everything had meaning. Every little part of his painting, if you are familiar with the hallucinogenic Toreador, you could, with Dali's paintings, you could stand back at a distance and you could actually see another image or another shape. He did the one with the bust of Voltaire. But the hallucinogenic Toreador, when you stood back at a distance, you saw the hat of the bullfighter and you saw the face of the bullfighter. But when you got up real close, the hat of the bullfighter was made up of all these little flies. Well, flies in the artistic world, when you're painting stuff, that has to do with death. So there's all this symbolism, and there's an actual message being portrayed. There's a message being delivered of what the artists themselves are actually thinking. And there's probably a few people still doing that kind of stuff, but what's popular today is this Jackson Pollock junk, where he dribbled and squirted paint all over a canvas and said, "Oh, that's art." And some idiot hipster somewhere with a man bun said, "Ooh, wow, that makes me feel good," or "that makes me feel like this," "Wow, I'm gonna go hang that in. I'm gonna pay, a lot of money for dribbles on a. I've seen animals. Search YouTube for animal paintings, and there's gonna be, or animals that paint. There's elephants, there's birds. It's ridiculous. People, animals can do what Jackson Pollock did. But they call Jackson Pollock's stuff art and say it has meaning when it's just squibbles on a page or on a canvas. So, it's this idea that you got to run more on emotion than you do on actual logistical fact or what the artist is actually implying, or what the writer of the book is actually saying, because 12 people can read the same thing and come up with 12 different plot lines or 12 different opinions of what the writer was actually saying, despite the fact that the writer is saying, this is it. It just occurred to me, if you remember the movie Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield. Big rich guy, his son's in college. He never went to college, so he wants to spend more time with his son and get, closer to his son. So he goes to his son's college and he joins the college and starts attending. So as he's trying to get his papers done, he actually brings in, I want to say it's Kurt Vonnegut. And he sits down with Kurt Vonnegut and interviews him. And, of course, somebody else is taking notes for him. But, he writes this paper from interviewing Kurt Vonnegut directly, and he turns his paper in and he gets he gets like a D on the paper. And the professor says that's not what it means at all, despite the fact that Rodney Dangerfield in this movie had actually talked to Kurt Vonnegut. And those were Kurt Vonnegut's own words. The professor said that's not what it means at all. So we're in this stage of our society where people have stopped thinking for themselves. Nobody thinks. People are just reacting. People are acting. We always wonder why politicians say everything's an emergency. Well, if everything's an emergency, then you can get people to vote any which way you want, because it's such a dire thing that you don't have time to research it. You just gotta vote. You gotta have this opinion that we give to you. And that's how we get an AOC. And that's how we get people that vote for an AOC. And it's not just politics. It happens in religion too. You get some guy who stands up there, or gal, stands up there and says, this is what the Bible means, or this is what this religious text means. This is what the Quran means. This is what the writings of Buddha mean. Don't read it for yourselves. Don't, just trust me on this. God gave me a vision and told me this is what it says. And, you know, a guy in Africa, in South Africa, in Johannesburg, is getting sued because he staged a resurrection. He wanted to make people think that he could bring people back from the dead like Jesus. Because he wants his congregation, his followers, his believers are not reading the Bible for themselves. They would know that that guy's full of it and that he's a false prophet and a false teacher and everything else. And when you don't teach people to actually study and think for themselves, they're easily manipulated and people become followers. And that largely is how Hitler was able to do what he did. This is what Roy Masters basically figured out in his research, is that you put people under so much stress that they're what they call the id, the imagination portion of your brain that does help you in critical thinking, shuts off. So when somebody like an AOC stands up there and says the world's going to end in 12 years because the environmental stuff is, we got out of the Paris Climate Accords, and we're, and honestly, the United States, and when you sit down and think for yourself, do a little bit of research, the United States has the lowest carbon emissions of any country in the world, because we're one of the most highly developed countries. All these other countries with massive carbon emissions and massive coal consumption is because they're still developing nations, and in a similar vein, the Sierra Club. And if you track down a guy named Charles Butler, he used to have a radio show over in Georgia. I don't know if he still does or not. I've seen a lot of him on Facebook now, doing Facebook Live. But he is a former naval officer and served on Ronald Reagan's nuclear commission. And the Sierra Club, the tree huggers, who are always concerned about some little mouse or some owl or some whatever, right? Sierra Club was created back in the 60s when nuclear technology really started to get popular and take off, in 60s going into the 70s. And the Sierra Club was created by big coal. The big coal companies got together and said, we need to fight this nuclear stuff so that we can keep building coal-fired coal-fired power plants and steam plants so that we can continue to sell our coal, despite the fact they could have just gone ahead and started selling their coal overseas, and they would have been okay. And so anyways, they created the Sierra Club, and the first test case actually that they used to shut down a nuclear power plant being built, they falsified research about a so-called endangered owl. They lied through their teeth. The judge believed him. He didn't do enough research on it. They probably paid him off too. But when they found that that was successful, they began to sue in a lot of other places, and they started getting this stuff shut down. Well, that was the beginning of the environmental movement. It had nothing to do with actually saving any kind of tree or plant or animal. It had nothing to do with the environment. It had everything to do with really large corporations keeping their power structure in place so they could continue to make lots of money. And I'm not an anti-capitalist by any stretch of the imagination, but in this case, the very same people that AOC and Bernie Sanders and everybody are saying are evil are the ones who actually started the green movement. And, fast forward to the Obama administration. And it basically backfires on the coal companies after so many years because Obama buys into this green movement crap. And I remember this clear as a bell because I live in the middle of coal country in central Alabama here. And Obama gets an endorsement from the United Mine Workers Association. That's not unusual. Unions support Democrats because Democrats will take taxpayer dollars to help pay for retirements for their union workers because the union leaders have squandered their money elsewhere. So not only do they get the votes, but then they get somebody who's going to vote them in some benefits and allow them to stay in power. Right. So anyway, so the Mine Workers Association endorses Obama, which means they gave him a whole bunch of money. And really, it's the leaders of the union, because the union itself is not allowed to give money to a political campaign, but the leaders of said union, who get paid, sometimes 10 times what their union workers make, they gave a bunch of money to Obama's campaign, right? Well, then 6 or 7 days later, Obama gives this grand speech and says he's going to shut down the coal industry. He's going to shut down the coal industry. The very same people that just said they would vote for him and gave him money to help him get elected, he says he's going to shut him down. And he came really, really, really close. Which is sad because in Alabama, we have some of the cleanest burning coal in the world. And, but that was, the Sierra Club mentality swings back around full circle, goes against the very people that started it. And it's that, nobody would bother to do their own research. Nobody would themselves. And, excuse me, when my father was a contractor, he got hired to build this project down on the beach, and it was going to be a walkway that was going to help the folks from this resort go over the sand dunes and down to the water. And it was going to lift it up off the ground. There would be very little impact to the sea oats. The animals would have cover, all this stuff. And it was actually shut down by some idiot claiming that some little beach mouse was going to be harmed. So, environmentalism is it's a nice idea, but the implementation of it is done poorly because the people that support environmentalism, they're idiots. They don't think for themselves. And I have no problem with people picking up trash on the side of the road. I have no problem with making sure a company's not dumping weird things into the river. I do have a problem with Obama's EPA actually spilling chemicals in a river and not bothering to clean it up. Imagine that, the Environmental Protection Agency, destroying the environment. But the people that believe that stuff don't think for themselves, and they don't have any idea what they're doing. They're not doing their own research. And that's how we get an AOC. That's how we get people like Obama put in office. And sometimes it's a coordinated effort between the powers that be that are already in office, the media. They'll sit on stories. They won't tell you. They won't give you all the information. They'll give you a bare minimum if they give you any at all. And they don't release information until it's politically convenient or expedient. And, we have to start thinking for ourselves. We are going back into the Dark Ages. If you go back and study the Dark Ages, even if you read about it on that worthless Wikipedia website, it was a period of time where very few people could read and write. There was no serious technological advancements. There was no, it was the status quo was being maintained by a few people in power, and that included religious people as well. They didn't want anybody to read and write. If you familiar with a guy named Michael Hart, he's got a book out there called Unknown America. Really fun read about little bits of misinformation we've been given over the years about our own history. But one of the things he's spoken of on his show, the Michael Hart Show, I'll have to go back and look at his website again, but search for Unknown America, Michael Hart Show. You can find him on Blog Talk Radio. You can find him on YouTube, Apple Podcast. But anyways, one of the things he was talking about was in the days of slavery, how there was actual black slaves that were suing. And this is before 1776. This is even when we were under the control of Great Britain in the early days of the colonies. There were slaves who were suing to get their freedom because there was some that were able to learn how to read and write and actually go back and study the law and then actually have a conversation with people. And the slave owners at that time, the slave masters, didn't want their slaves at that time to be able to read. And obviously, if you can't read, you can't write. But the more ignorant they are, the more control the slave has over them, right? Sound familiar? The more ignorant we are as a society, the easily controlled we are. The more ignorant the electorate is, there's over 350 million people in this country, legal citizens roughly. There's some 20 or 30 million illegal citizens. But of the legal citizens in this country that vote, there's only about 100 million that actually do get out and vote every cycle. And 1/3 of the country. Now, if you will assume that roughly 2/3 of the country are of legal voting age and meet all the legal requirements to vote, so they're not felons and all that sort of stuff. So there's some 200 to plus million people that should be eligible to vote and could vote, but there's only about 100 million actually voting. So all the ignorant folks are not voting, for sure, because they don't think it's important. They haven't studied history, or for whatever reason, they just don't care. But then you have a portion on either side of it, right or left, who they get their talking points and that's what they go with. They just want, just tell me what to think, tell me how to vote. I mean, you hear that from political talk show hosts if you listen to them long enough. Somebody will come and ask them, so-and-so, who do I vote for? And it's like, why do you want my opinion? It's your vote. You vote the way you think you should vote. But we're not thinking for ourselves. Our brains are being shut down. We're being put under so much stress, financial hardship. When Obama was in office, what did he do? He tanked the economy even further than anything they did under George W. Bush. The numbers are there. The proof is in the pudding, because even though the stock market was high, that's not a good indication of a thriving economy, certainly not by itself. And, the wages were going down, increased numbers on the rolls for social benefits, unemployment, people were stopped looking for work, all this stuff. So as you have less money, you have more stress in your life. All you ladies out there, you know this. But the more stress you have, the more easy it is to manipulate you. I've worked for bosses in the past who would give you the most bare, basic information to do your job. They wouldn't help you, or at least tell you what was going to be happening down the road so that you could better plan. And it allowed them to be in constant contact with you and in constant control of you, because they were constantly having to come and check on you to give you your next assignment, instead of actually giving you your work list and say, hey, get this done. And it made for a crappy place to work. I hated working places like that. And I didn't stay very long. So, to close this up and wrap it up, instead of being redundant and running my mouth here forever and ever, do your own research. Think for yourself. It's out there. There's enough news sources and information sources that you can find out what's going on. What are the bills coming up? Um, what's your pastor preaching about? Do you ever, do you ever take a few notes or write down the scriptures at least to go back after the service and read through those passages of scripture to find out if your preacher's actually preaching the word of God? Are you verifying facts? Are you trying to learn yourself? Because they're not teaching that in school anymore. Promise you that. And because of that, that's how we end up with an AOC. So, leave me a question, leave me a comment. Hit like if you like it. If you don't like it, do me a favor and tell some folks how crappy this is, and they should come and watch this train wreck. So.